Hey, I'm Sasan Kasravi with Proteus Debate Academy. We are a YouTube channel that tries to give high quality coaching for free. Uh, I got up this morning and I was like, I'm gonna do like 2 round analysis videos, right? Because last night I made this spreadsheet with every round that I think has ever been requested for us to do an analysis of, which there were 45 of. We've done like 8, 9, something like that. And then I sat down to do it, and 10 minutes later I got an email, and I had been signed up by my work to judge a middle school tournament. So I judged 4 middle school rounds in a row. But it's okay. I'm back for more abuse. So let me show you that spreadsheet. So this is what the spreadsheet looks like. And nobody has to read it except for me, so it can look this hideous and schizophrenic. And I don't really have a round in mind. So why don't we just do this? Pick a number between 1 and 45. Okay. 44. That is Harvard 2015 Public Forum Debate Round Robin Finals. That's good. It was probably requested significantly over a year ago, but maybe less. I don't know. Let's find out what's up with this round. If it's 2015, then I don't think I will have any idea what the topic is. Let me get my face back in here. Whoa. Is it really laggy right now? Oh, okay. Figured itself out. Okay. You don't need to see anybody's bottom right corner. This looks like what was asked. I guess let me put on headphones so that there is less echo. We got some stuff coming up on the channel that we haven't talked about, but it's because I don't really know what we're doing, because Paul went on his honeymoon, even though he got married like a year ago, because we were in a global pandemic. Alright. Is this working? Yes. Alright. I don't know who's who. And this is long enough ago that I don't have to... I'm sure these people are no longer children, right? This was like 7, 8, 12 years ago. We'll call them affirmative and negative, even though maybe the negative will go first because it's a public forum. Let's just go with it, because maybe I can make this one... Let's see, so 42-minute video. Let's see if I can keep this under an hour and a half. Historically, I have not done a great job with things like that, but let's see. Cool. All right. Who is this? Jesus. This person looks familiar. Wait a minute. Don't tell me the winner, please. I just want to know who the people are. I don't think that I know either of these people. Alright, I don't think I know these people. Okay.
Sasan and I affirm resolved, on balance, economic globalization benefits worldwide poverty reduction. Contention 1, comparative advantage.
Sorry, I need to hear that one more time because I was not paying attention.
Is everyone ready? Sasan and I affirm resolved, on balance, economic globalization benefits worldwide poverty reduction.
Economic globalization benefits worldwide poverty reduction? I mean, in terms of absolute poverty, yes. right? Am I crazy? Is there much controversy here? Are we gonna argue over the definition of globalization, or like what kind of poverty we're talking about? I don't know. Let's hear it. And they are on the AF, I believe, so go ahead.
Contention 1, comparative advantage. Globalization involves the removal of barriers to international trade. Indeed, as the World Trade Organization explains, over the past few decades, governments in most countries have increasingly opened their economies to international trade through new trading systems, increased regional cooperation, or domestic reform programs. According to Frank Ackerman of Tufts University, economic globalization allows countries to raise productivity and efficiency in their economies by specializing in the industries to which they are best suited. For example, because China has an enormous supply of cheap labor, while the US has a greater number of skilled workers, it is more efficient to have basic, low-skill manufacturing take place in China and high-skill manufacturing happen here. In a world with trade barriers, this is not possible. Karen Walsh of the National Bureau of Economic...
I mean, obviously the World Trade Organization is going to say some shit like that, but like, come on. Like a person living in Saudi Arabia is well suited for their country to have oil, and so their industries are based on that, but somebody who lives in, like, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a country that doesn't have oil, but I don't know enough about the world to say that with confidence. I'm going to say Ghana. Somebody who lives in Ghana isn't well suited to have an oil industry. I hear it, but a lot of it has to do with, like, resource exploitation and not so much, like, what work is suited towards the skills of a person in a particular place, right? And that's why a lot of people are complaining about, like, industries leaving the United States. Like, the people who were working in car factories in the 80s felt that they were plenty suited to be working in car factories. It's not like Detroit was better suited to be, like, a moneyless hellhole. But sure, fine argument. I get it. Specialization. Right on. Let's keep going.
Research explains, looking at 118 studies, that countries that have liberalized trade experience increases in their annual rates of growth by 1.5%. A report from Harvard University explains that economic growth is a powerful force in reducing poverty, noting that GDP...
Here's an interesting thing. Not super related. The term economic growth is very poorly understood. And in fact, and I'm not even saying that, like, now let me explain to you what economic growth means. It like, genuinely speaking, we take for granted that we know what we're measuring when we say economic growth, but that's actually a very controversial question. Like, what are we actually measuring when we say economic growth? Like, a lot of people will say the GDP, but moving on. It's not necessarily, especially in public forum, less now that it's getting more, like, K and theory heavy. But when I watch a lot of these older rounds, like, a lot of people, and it's still true of, say, like, I don't know, middle school public forum, a lot of people in public forums arguments are like, econ up arrow good, like the line went up, but really have a very nuanced impact behind that, which relates to the quality of any given person's life. But I've rudely no way this is going to be less than an hour and a half. Okay, let's go. You already know, you're watching this, you've seen it at the bottom. You're either like, wow, he must have really been worried and he managed to do it, or you're judging me for how not close the final result is, and you know, and I don't yet.
GDP growth is associated with income growth for the poorest 40% of the population in a one-to-one relationship. Contention 2, foreign direct investment. Foreign direct investment, known as FDI, is the capital investment in a business by an investor from another country for ownership rights in the enterprise. According to MPRA, in the last decade of globalization, the economic linkage between countries has been strengthened primarily by FDI flows. The European Journal of Interdisciplinary Studies explains that often businesses in developing countries lack initial capital required to produce their own products. Investors in developed countries can help these businesses overcome high initial costs. Indeed, Jeffrey Graham of Citibank explains that the overwhelming majority of foreign direct investment is made in the form of fixtures, machinery, equipment, and buildings. FDI accomplishes economic growth and poverty reduction in several ways. First, stable growth. Two factors unique to FDI are critical for economic stability. First, as Punjab University explains, FDI does not create debt. As a result, losses are absorbed by outside investors instead of by straining domestic creditors, governments, and financial institutions. Second, according to Martin Feldstein of NBER, FDI results in a diversification of investment that reduces overall risk to investors by spreading it out over investors from different countries. Ultimately, the Journal of Economic Cooperation empirically confirms that FDI levels remain resilient in economic crisis, preventing sudden changes in the economy. Globalization thus prevents domestic institutions from collapsing, reducing the need for government bailouts or tax increases whose effects disproportionately fall on the poor. Next, human capital developments. Selma Kustri of American University explains.
Okay, real quick, FDI argument sounded fine. I don't know. Economics is just very boring to me, but sure. And I don't mean in the context of debate. They're fine debate arguments. Just in my life, I don't know. I don't like money, as you can tell from how this channel doesn't make any. No, I mean, it seems fine. Foreign direct investment is a product of globalization. It is a steady way of getting money to low-income countries. Those countries need that money to develop their economy so that they can compete and participate in the global market, and other means don't really provide as safe a way of doing that because you don't really have a lot of debt and you avoid having to have neighboring countries bail people out. Who knows if that's true, but the arguments, it's sound, right? In argumentation, we have whether an argument's valid or whether it's sound. So if all of these premises are true, the conclusion follows. I would have liked to see a more pronounced impact. We have that there's a one-to-one relationship between the lowest 25% of like people in poverty having their, I guess wages wasn't the term, but their income, their wealth, increase in a one-to-one relationship with, I think she said, the GDP. That doesn't sound right, but maybe it is. I don't know. So that's the only thing we really have in terms of an impact. And you have to remember that the point of your arguments is to reach an impact, right? At the beginning of the debate, you either say or you, I guess, imply like some sort of weighing, some sort of decision-making mechanism for the judge, right? Whether that's net benefits or util or consequentialism or not consequentialism or whatever it is, right? Your impacts really are just how you are demonstrating that you are winning by that decision-making metric, whether it's explicitly how you're telling the judge to make the decision or how you assume a judge will make a decision. And not having impacts explicitly stated risks not directly explaining to the judge how you won the round, right? It's like trying to explain how you won a game of chess without describing how you got the checkmate. Like, hold on. I got a phone call. This is what I get for, one, having a camera that is my phone, and two, being one of the 6 people left in modern society that regularly makes phone calls. All right, I said enough about impacts. They're important, right? I think what I was saying is that it's like trying to describe to a judge how you won a game of chess without explicitly explaining the checkmate part, right? Where it's like you're just trying to explain all the conditions that in your mind lead to a checkmate and hoping the judge sees the same moves, right? Which they might not. Let's continue.
That developing countries face a mismatch where they have abundant labor supply that cannot be used because of scarce capital. FDI helps capital deficiency and is thus associated with the creation of employment opportunities. Moreover, FDI helps shift unskilled labor force to a skilled one through labor training, transfer of skills, and the transfer of organizational practices. Carl Aaron of International Finance Corporation quantifies that FDI has directly created over 26 million jobs in developing countries. For each job, he furthers, 1.6 additional jobs were indirectly created from induced spending and partnerships with domestic firms. Next, increasing government revenue. A report in the NBER explains that with
Okay, so that was a little confusing because we were saying, okay, I think these are all like sub points under FDI, because she keeps saying next, but I don't know if we're moving on from FDI or if we're just talking about another thing that is good about FDI, which I guess isn't the end of the world, but isn't as clear as it could be.
Investment capital that is transferred generates profits in the receiving country that are subject to corporate taxation in the developing country, thus increasing government revenue. A report by Technopac empirically confirms this, noting that in India, FDI in retail is expected to increase government tax revenues by 5-fold by 2020, thus allowing them to finance more programs for the poor. Lastly, crowding in. By creating linkages and partnerships with domestic firms and industries, FDI spurs domestic investment and industry growth throughout the local economy. The European Scientific Journal quantifies, finding that in an analysis of 56 developing countries, for every dollar of FDI, there is a corresponding dollar increase in domestic investment. Ultimately, William Klein of the Peterson Institute for International Development concludes in a meta-analysis of 80 studies that increased financial participation in the global economy is associated with a significant growth of 2% of GDP each year. According to the World Bank, a 1% increase in GDP per capita results in poverty reduction of 1.7%. For all these reasons, Sinan and I are proud to affirm.
Okay, so that was pretty good, but I think we have to kind of keep in mind what the finish line is. And a topic like this is very explicit about how a team wins, right? So in this case, it's not just that globalization is good. The finish line, like the win condition, is contained within the resolution, which is you have to demonstrate that it's good for poverty rates. And in this case, they have some arguments going for them. They have some card just now that says 1.7% of whatever. Decent. You got one card saying that it will increase some countries' GDP by up to 5-fold by 2020, which must have seemed like a long time from then, which will allow them to spend money on improving poverty. No specific card that says this will happen, right? Or has happened. So that's a little weak. And then we have this GDP growth has a 1-to-1 correlation with increasing the like wealth or income of the bottom 25% of people in poverty. I judged a middle school round earlier today where it was an LD round, and I think the next there's some LD, there's some policy, there's some Parley rounds in the spreadsheet, and if I roll onto one of them, I will do whatever. So we're going to mix it up with a few more formats, and any rounds any of you request, wherever you do it, Reddit, in the YouTube comments here, I will add to that spreadsheet. Point being, the question in that round was, hey, my opponent was speaking really fast. They gave me the speech doc, but it was just a lot of words. How do I process it quickly? And the answer is that, well, you get better at it, but in the time being, you have to identify what you're looking for, right? Like, what are the things that you're actually paying attention to? What do you need to respond to? And if you're the negative, you need to very quickly identify what arguments, what points in this case lead to a win condition. Those are the three, right? The bringing people out of poverty with the 1-to-1 relationship with the GDP, opening up funds to potentially spend on poverty services, and the last card that just got read. And then once you identify that, you can be like, okay, what else have they said that what other like cards or whatever evidence might be in service of that, might be the link to that impact or whatever. But it's important to develop the skill of quickly identifying, okay, which things actually lead a team to win. Because it becomes way easier to have good cross-ex then. It becomes way easier to read good answers then. Let's see what the negative does, and I guess I will not vocalize what these conditions are, but you should do that as you're trying to watch. Can you identify which things actually can lead this side to win, and will we agree on that when I share after the speech? Let's see. Let me just skip over the painfully long time in every round before they actually start speaking. Oh.
Because the race should only be run when everyone is ready, Matthew and I negate the result. Contention 1, spreading the addiction. Globalization increases the flow of narcotics for 3 reasons. First, Martha Olcott of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace explicates that the diffusion of communication and technology has spread the drug patterns to other regions, while an integrated financial system permits greater money laundering. Essentially, it becomes easier to operate and spread influence. Second, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime explains that even national efforts fail to stifle contraband flow because global demand has outpaced the ability to manage commercial flows. As Olcott puts it, when one group disappears, another quickly appears as the market is driving the process. Third, Tom Fay Ling in his book Cocaine Nation notes that the system of comparative advantage creates little desire for products from countries like Peru and Bolivia. Consequently, countries choose to tacitly support coca production as it generates the best return in the global economy. Drug trafficking has a twofold implication for poverty. First, Meryl Singer in the International Journal of Drug Policy writes that drug trafficking organizations create endemic corruption among government officials because of bribes and threats. Corruption exacerbates social poverty by creating a less responsive government. This also negatively affects economic poverty reduction because the government has no obligation to its people. Second, Robert Casena of the National Bureau of Economic Research finds that drug use affects factors in poverty, including education and human capital, thereby concluding that poverty rates could increase by as much as 50%. Connection 2, fueling the engine. Michael Clare in his book Rising Power, Shrinking Planet outlines that oil consumption has been the backbone for globalization as trade and transport depend directly on it. However, our dependency on oil has a threefold consequence. First, Jeff Rubin in his book The Big Flat Line underlines that the rising consumer demand in India and China drives commodity prices up, adversely affecting those elsewhere in the world by limiting access. Second, Nafis Ahmed from the Institute for Policy Research and Development details that global market forces of demand can place high valuations on resources, spurring conflict where no party involved wants to seek control. As the World Bank continues, civil conflicts are costly as they turn back the clock on 30 years' worth of GDP growth and put a country 20 percentage points behind in overcoming poverty. Third, Michael Roll in his book Fueling the World, Failing the Region highlights that consumer countries and companies can insulate a leader from the demands of the people, providing the government a source of external revenue. Tension 3, betting the farm. While development programs may benefit poverty reduction in the long term, realistic discussions have to amply provide for short-term staples. Otherwise, the accomplishments of tomorrow have no meaning for the poor of today. In this sense, globalization creates a fluctuating food market that comes at the expense of local consumers and producers. On the consumption side, food is being produced domestically, and it doesn't even feed the population. Al Gore in his book The Future writes that countries and companies buy large tracts of land in Africa to either feed their own populations or sell on the global market. Another concern is the globalized financial market, which paves the way for speculative investment. Friedrich Kaufmann in his book Bet the Farm underscores that the creation of commodity indexes allows investors to pour hundreds of billions of dollars into food derivatives and futures contracts. As food becomes another mode of asset allocation, when prices rose, more money poured into the system. Consequently, Kaufman quantifies that 250 million new people plunged into poverty, while food prices rose 80% from 2005 to 2008. The problem, as he detailed, was that a billion of the poorest people on Earth were bidding against the billion of the richest people for the same food. Regarding producers, Joachim Badron with the International Food Policy Research Institute explains that developed countries practice protectionism in regard to food production, benefiting large-scale producers and effectively a monopoly while depressing world prices for food, thereby crowding out domestic producers in developing countries. However, even when prices are high, Kaufman again iterates that it raises the cost of associated inputs like fuel and fertilizer, so profits aren't higher. Ultimately, volatility is affecting no one. The International Fund for Agricultural Development impacts that upward pricing harms consumers, and uncertainty in the market prevents planning, discourages risky investment, and deters more production for the market by producers. Thus, we negate.
We're going to take a little bit of prep.
Great, they're going to take prep. Okay, so that was a pretty well organized case, and it's up to you now to, in your little brilliant head, be like, hey, here are the actual win conditions. And they were pretty well organized and pretty well stated. So let me, I guess, cut to the chase. All of them have to do with... So this debate, again, like, identifying what the main win conditions are will also, you'll very quickly be like, okay, what is the real clash here? What does this round come down to? If I am in this debate and I know I'm giving the last speech, I am already writing that speech because I know this debate is going to come down to a question of costs versus wages. All of the benefits to poverty that the affirmative is talking about comes, not all of them. There is just this also like, hey, like this would give more people, give the government more money to spend on like poverty programs, but no real evidence that says they will do that. And if I'm the negative, certainly I'm going to argue that they don't like just win this phantom link there, right? So most of the affirmative's arguments are going to tie in through like labor. That means your money's coming in through wages. And on the negative, most of the costs are like, most of the effects on poverty aren't like, oh, well, people are going to like take money or wages are going to decrease. It's coming at, well, the cost of food is going to increase or something like that. In a debate between these two, if I have to flip a coin and guess, you know, I'm going to give it to the negative, because costs are a flat and blanket effect that affect everyone. And wages are, one, going to affect fewer people, because there will always be people that don't or can't work. But also, two, is it can disappear more easily than food costs can quickly go back down, right? It's more reversible. So the irreversibility factor of like human costs, of living costs, seems more significant than whatever you're going to argue in terms of your unskilled labor being paid a certain amount, and then eventually some organizations coming in and helping you transform into skilled labor so that you can one day, like 15 years from now, do some other stuff. The other thing that they have going for them is the negative is winning the time frame debate, right? Their impacts function on a very short scale. The affirmative is inherently always going to be talking about long scale, right? You wouldn't expect, I mean, you could, but the negative's arguments aren't really discussing a scenario where, you know, globalization happens, like resources gets, oil or whatever is sold for whatever, and this and that happens, and then way down the line some negative thing happens, or poverty increases or something along those lines, right? They're talking about more immediate impacts. One thing I don't particularly love about the negative is the addiction argument. Not that it's not valid and not that it's not good, but it just, I wish there was a more explicit and more highlighted like link scenario. I know it's there, right? I know that a addiction leads to poverty, but I think you're just gonna have a hard time outweighing the scale and like scope, right? Like, do we have instances of drug addiction in a company getting so significant that the number of people who are addicted to drugs affects the poverty rate so much that an otherwise upward trending economy gets turned downward specifically because of the rate of drug addiction? I think probably not, right? I think it's probably arguable that the drug addiction and alcoholism and whatever the root cause is poverty, or whatever the case, right? I think you're just going to have a really hard time having that be your only winning argument, right? Having the affirmative say, here's all of the reasons why the economy is going to improve, the poverty rate is going to improve, and then the negative saying, yes, but this alone will reverse all of that, will undo all of that. And that's really significant, because each argument you make in debate should be sufficient to win the debate on its own. That's something not a lot of people understand. So I'll say it again, right? Let's say you have 3 contentions in your case. Each of those contentions should be good enough on its own to win you an entire debate. Because if it cannot, that means you will end up at the end of the debate having to go for another argument. And that means every second you spent talking about the first argument was a waste of your time. Debates are decided on one argument, right? No judge says, like, I like this argument and I think it's true, but it's not important enough to win the debate, and yet in combination with this other argument, I think these two combined can take out this one argument. That's just not the way judges tend to make decisions. The way judges tend to make decisions is they'll think, what's the most significant thing? Does it happen? Is it true? And then which side made that argument? So you're only going to, that's the whole premise behind a collapse, right? You're going to identify what is the one issue that the judge is going to care about at the end of the debate. If I can help them care about that issue, like which of my issues can I take that spot in the judge's mind? And if it's not even the most important issue in your case, or you can't make it seem that important, it's a waste of your time. Anyway, pretty good case. Let's see this cross-ex in like 40 minutes.
You get us your first contention,
Oh, they're asking for evidence.
and then the 250 million.
Can we just give you the case? Like,
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh! Boy child on the right. I platonically love that child. I think Plato discussed like 12 different kinds of love. And if there's a love for like not making the things you hate happen, then that is the whatever Greek word is for you have avoided my pet peeve. That goes to my friend to the right side of the screen. Okay, cross-ex happening. Love it. Let's go.
So, are you ready? So in your second contention, what civil conflict are you talking about?
What do you mean? We give you 2 different examples of civil conflicts. So we give you examples of intrastate conflicts, which is the rise of civil wars in the area.
Okay, so such as?
Okay, I was getting to that. So we talk specifically about how these factions within the country start fighting over these resources.
Okay, just give an example or something.
An example of a region?
Or like a conflict that has occurred, something like that.
Okay, we can't give you a specific name of a conflict because this is
Why?
smaller conflicts.
Right, yeah. Sian will address that.
Hold on. It wasn't a great question, but you should be able to be like, for example, this thing. I just judged a public forum round where the topic is social media has done more harm than good to democracy and all that. And the negative goes up and is like, yo, misinformation's really bad. And social media is really bad for misinformation. And I was like, great, you won the debate because that's the best argument to make on this topic. And in cross-ex, the other side's like, can you give me an example of, like, misinformation? And they were like, what do you mean? It's like, well, can you tell us, like, a piece of misinformation that happened with, like, an election? Or, like, did misinformation happen in the 2020 election? And they were like, yeah. So give me an example. And they're like, well, we can't think of an example. So you can't think of an example in the 2020 election? Any piece of misinformation that was in any way significant? And I think what will happen is people prepare these cases that talk about general trends, and misinformation happens generally, but they either don't research for specific examples or they just don't read into the topic enough to then be able to, like, I'm sure your evidence even gives specific examples. Like, there's no literature in the world that's like, this creates conflicts generally. We don't have any specific reasons why we think that or examples to point to, but just imagine conflicts. They're small. You can't name them. Okay.
Do you have a question?
So in your first contention, you talk about comparative advantage, and the spread of social specialization is what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Increases productivity, right?
Yeah.
But what happens to a country when nobody wants what they specialize in?
Okay, so basically every country has some kind of comparative advantage that they can specialize in.
That's a good answer, but that's not really... Unskilled labor is just people, right? Like, that's what you're really saying, right? Like, there's shit jobs that nobody wants to do, and if you live in the slums of Calcutta, you will probably do that shit for enough bread to not die. Like, that's the answer, right? The labor exists as long as people are able to work. Like, that's the market. There's gonna be a safer, probably, like, more jargony answer than that, but the answer you want to give is just direct. Like, no. I'm not saying that, like, it's like the Ninja Turtles where, like, one of them is really funny and the other one does machines. It's like, okay, these people are really poor and they will do this thankless job that is dangerous and horrific. And it will benefit them because it's better than not doing anything and making no money. But that's the, like, labor market that really our evidence is talking about. Every country has something to offer in that context. Let's see what the answer is.
Ultimately, maybe they're not going to all realize it at once because they might not have investors going there, but eventually investors are going to basically invest in the country where they're going to be the most efficient and where they can benefit the most from.
Okay, how exactly has specialization impacted Peru and Bolivia?
I mean, Peru has a lot of mining, and I know that they specialize a lot in raw materials.
Okay.
All right.
Do you have a question for me?
Yeah. So in your first contention, you talk about the drug trade.
Yes.
So was the illicit drug trade happening before globalization? Globalization
Yes,
is just exactly. So to what extent has that made worse? Because all that's happening with globalization is you're, like, reducing tariffs or you're removing some barriers. All you're doing is affecting.
Or you're creating a massive market for the drugs.
The rest we give you towards globalization is that globalization exacerbates this issue.
Yeah, how, like, to what extent and why is that necessarily
because
true?
there's
I mean,
not that many people doing heroin in Afghanistan. But when you have a global market... Okay, I'll stop shouting.
In Central Asia, opium trafficking increased
that was good.
by 300% from 1991 to 1993 directly as a result of globalization.
And these were happening on the, like, officially they were trading opium, or was this being done
Who cares?
Because globalization only refers to the opening of official trade channels or official modes of interconnectivity.
Nope.
This is all happening on the black market, right?
No. Okay, it doesn't matter if it's happening on the black market. You have opened these trade channels which the black market can use to illegally trade opium in a way that it would not have been able to do if not for the existence of the official trade channels, right? Is the answer, but let's hear it.
That would have, like, it just as easily could have happened earlier.
Okay, what definition can you show us that specifically says that official?
I mean, economic.
Like people aren't, like, putting a bunch of, like, opium on their backs and walking across borders. They're coming on shipping containers that are otherwise carrying other non-illicit groups. Like, watch, I don't know, The Wire? You guys know what The Wire is? It's watch The Wire if you would like to be good at this 2015 topic.
Globalization refers to the removal of trade barriers or like you're reducing tariffs to that extent. That's what economic globalization is.
Okay, we can dispute that later.
All right, fine.
Do you have a question for me?
Yeah, so in your last contention, you talk a lot about agriculture. Right. Okay. So, and you say we don't really need to value the long term, right? But wouldn't you agree that it's okay if we're having some booms and busts, we're having some issues, if in the long term, ultimately, we're all doing better off, right?
Okay, why exactly would you say that these people
See,
are better off?
the app is already locking itself into long term.
Has there been a single country that's actually escaped from long term, or actually achieved long-term poverty reduction without first industrializing? Or any country that's remained agriculturally dependent that has actually been able to reduce poverty substantially?
Okay, but we'll argue that this development is different because
Fair.
it entrenches.
So in order to actually develop, you have to industrialize and move away from this agricultural context.
I think there was a much more effective way of asking the question, but I think it was a pretty fair point. And I think, like, the way that in our asking effective questions, video and in the guest lecture that I did on the Public Forum Discord YouTube channel. I talk about how like the most effective thing you can do in cross-examination, actually the most effective thing you can do is make your opponent look dumb. The second most effective thing you can do in cross-examination is get your opponent to say things that they don't realize is going to hurt them, right? Because if you're like, hey, so are you saying that that you need to industrialize in order to decrease poverty? They'll say no. And the slightly more gotcha version of that is can you give me an example of a country that reduced poverty without industrializing? That's a slightly more gotcha version, but they'll still avoid that. They'll be like, I don't understand the question. What do you mean? Well, it's nuanced. But what you want is for them to give what they think is a safe answer, but you are actually going to use that. So you ask a question like, can you give me an example of a country that's been that's done a good job of reducing poverty or something like that? And if you can then show that that country did it through industrialization, you have a much stronger case, because then they cannot later come up and be like, well, that country's not actually a good example. If you had just started out with that country, they would have the ability to step away from that country as the example. But you're trying to lock them into something that they don't know you can use it against them. That's the whole strategy behind cross-ex. Let's watch some prep time go. Sorry, I'm losing my mind. This is like the 5th round in a row for me today. But I gotta get this done, so I appreciate you guys watching me at the frayed edges of sanity. Who's taking pictures? Oh, I guess it's like a big tournament's finals. Don't do that. Don't do that exhale thing.
Two important openings before we get into their case. The first is that no country in history has ever feasibly and in a sustainable way reduced poverty absent industrialization, absent a shift from an agricultural economy to an industrialized economy. And we're going to show you exactly why that is exclusive to a world in which globalization is occurring.
Fair. Fair.
Second of all, look to the ILO. They explain that 240 million jobs have been created as a result of comparative advantage being taken advantage of, and has opened up jobs for people in the developing world. That's going to be critical, because these are all people who now have comparatively more means to buy food and basic necessities than before. With that, let's get into their first contention. They talk about drugs, a lot of issues here. The first is that this is referring to globalization, not economic globalization. They themselves tell you that the facilitation of the drug trade has to do with communication, not anything to do with removing trade barriers or barriers to financial investment. At that point, it's not topical. But second of all, there are disincentives to operating in the drug trade when you open up legal trade avenues. Reducing tariffs specifically means that now people have a disincentive to take the risk of illicit trading and are more likely to not operate in these drug cartels. And third of all, if you look to Becker of the Wall Street Journal, he explains that their entire case is explicable by alternate causality. He explains that now drug cartels are making more money because there's a smaller supply, since people are disincentivized from the illegal channels, and that's why it appears as though there's an expansion, but actually it's just alternately causal. Let's go to their second contention, where they talk about fueling the engine. First problem, they never tell you how much prices are going up by, so we have no idea how much civil conflict is going to be exacerbated by what extent. There's no way to weigh this contention. But second of all, they literally can't give you examples. They're just like, civil conflict happens. Conflict over resources always happens, and we're telling you that it's not at all unique to a world in which globalization happens, particularly when now things are being traded for at a lower price. It's easier to get more commodities, since not every country has to be self-sustaining as they have to be in a protectionist world. So we would argue that conflict is mitigated, and that's a reason to vote for us on that contention, not for them. Now, let's talk about their third contention. They talk a lot about how even if long-term things are going to decrease and there's a long-term reduction in poverty, that's not going to matter. First of all, we contend to you that really matters, because it means that every increase in poverty they talk about is nominal and doesn't have any long-term impact. But second of all, look to the United Nations. They explain that the capital that foreign direct investment is supplying to these countries is allowing them to modernize their agricultural industries. That means A, that efficiency in these countries is going up, which means that more people have access to food, but B, now people don't all have to work in the agricultural agricultural industry, which is endemic to places with poverty, they can shift to the industrial place. This is the crux of our case. Without industrialization, by trying to have a protectionist economy that is primarily agrarian, it is literally impossible to shift out of poverty in a sustainable way. So qualitatively, every single thing they're talking about is not only short-term, but it's really irrelevant to the big picture on poverty. Next, they tell you that speculative investment is a terrible thing. Bubbles are not inherently bad. A lot of the times, bubbles can drive investment in an area and have long-term benefits. The dot-com bubble, for example, that wasn't really a bad thing because it led to a lot of startups later on and eventually led to a huge amount of technological revolutions in the world. So we would tell you the popping of a bubble is a short-term impact, but in the long-term consideration, there are more benefits for absolutely everybody. Finally, they're basically telling you that we're depressing prices for food, and that's a bad thing. And then earlier on in their contention, they're telling you that food prices are getting higher. They need to pick one, but we would tell you that yes, food prices are going down because there's more efficient production, and now there's more trade. That specifically means that poor people can more easily afford this. So just in terms of that, just in terms of their access to things which make them poor, or their lack of access, that is being mitigated under a world with globalization. So ultimately, every single thing in their case they're giving you is short-term, it's only affecting certain countries like Peru or Bolivia. That's all they can substantiate their contentions with, and we're telling you the comparative advantage overwhelmingly benefits many countries. And remember, it is a dynamic comparative advantage. They don't all have to do this at once. For those reasons, we're very proud to affirm. Thank you.
Okay, that was a pretty good speech. Here's a couple things that I would bring to your attention, though. One, they are hard locked into long-term versus short-term, which, you know, they're saying is more stable, they're saying is more important, but they also kind of have to. I'm sure if they could win short-term and long-term, they would choose to, right? But just with the way that their evidence is going, they've correctly identified we need to start making long-term stuff sound really good. A couple other things I want to bring to your attention. Everything that the affirmative is saying is still only being funneled through the specific channels that they've provided for how poverty is going to be decreased, which so far is really only, especially as what's emphasized in, I mean, I know this speech isn't like a summary, it's not really focusing on emphasizing the affirmative, but it's still channeled through like labor. The third thing that I want to bring to your attention is that a lot of the focus on this speech is about how not globalizing, not industrializing does not get rid of poverty. But that's not necessarily the burden of the negative, right? The resolution, and I don't have it in front of me, isn't like bi-directional. It's like, this is effective. And all the negative has to show is that it's not effective. It doesn't matter if the alternative also isn't effective, right? Like, jumping really high is not a effective way of reaching Jupiter. I don't have to show that there's some other way that's more effective for reaching Jupiter, as long as I just show, like, look, there's just no scenario in which you take a running start, jump, and reach the planet Jupiter. And I think that's where the negative needs to kind of shift this focus, because right now they're letting it be painted as, well, how else are you going to reduce poverty? But that's not their burden, as far as my understanding goes. But I thought that speech was pretty good. I'm just trying to point out the issues that the affirmative still has to contend with. But to his credit, if he's right that the negative is going for, food cost decrease, and that hurts farmers, but also they increase, so they hurt consumers, that is potentially harmful for them, and something they should have noticed when they were writing their case and had like a more focused scenario that they're trying to describe. The other thing that I'll say is that the affirmative says, well, the negative is only talking about countries like Bolivia and Peru, but the affirmative, we're talking about other countries. Never mind that the negative was also talking about a bunch of countries, and you asked them to name some, and they said Bolivia and Peru, and I think that's what happened in Cross-X. But the point is that you're still not saying what countries. You haven't specified more countries that the affirmative applies to, or a reason why it necessarily applies to more countries. You've just said that it applies to more. So that's something that I would look out for if I was the negative.
We'll take some prep. Here's be starting on the con case. At the top, working its way down within this. Are my judges ready? The audience?
Also, dude, in that 2 minutes of prep, that would have been I wasn't going to say anything about the rando that walked in through the back and decided to just sit down. But hey, man, there were 2 minutes of prep. That was probably a good opportunity to go sit down on the other side rather than awkwardly sit in shot. That's fine. I've shamed this man sufficiently, I think.
My notes. And Carol. On the contention one, Sasan essentially tells you that the increased risk in trafficking actually deters drug trafficking itself. But the problem is you can look towards Claudia Storti. She finds that this simply isn't true. We've seen that drug seizures have increased tenfold over the past few years. But the problem is there are only two explanations for why this occurs, and we're telling you why globalization is the only reason. First, she says drug seizures increase because law enforcement perhaps is more effective. But that simply isn't the case. Because if law enforcement were more effective, then the increased risk would also be associated with an increased retail cost of the drugs themselves on the market. But the problem is drug prices overall have depressed significantly as a result of globalization. Thus, she concludes that we've actually seen, because drug seizures are increasing, we can also see the tenfold increase in drug trafficking. Here we're giving you the uniqueness on globalization leading to drug trafficking, and we're also telling you why the risk actually isn't there. But additionally,
you need to answer the globalization is not economic globalization argument. That's really the link that they read that needs to get answered.
Sasan tells you that there's alternate causality, that we're actually stifling supply. Essentially, he's trying to advocate for the U.S. war on drugs and the anti-drug policies that target supply. The problem is Tom Failing in his book Cocaine Nation finds that our anti-drug policies are...
Is that even what he said, or is that just something you had an answer to and now you're reading it? Like, you're going to get to the globalization versus economic globalization thing, right?
Latin American countries know this too, and the United States threaten these countries with what they call decertification. What decertification is that the United States threatens Latin American countries to pick one of two things. Either they continue failing the U.S. war on drug policies, or they're decertified. The United States works through the IMF, through the World Bank, to vote against helpful loans against these countries. So in Colombia, for example, found in 1996, Colombia actually entered a recession from which only now they're emerging. Essentially, we're telling you again, they're in a damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario. Go to the contention 3.
Nope, missed it.
Here, Sasan tells you a couple of things about why we actually increase productivity and why we actually work towards manufacturing. First and foremost, Tim Worsall from Forbes finds that we actually don't see manufacturing jobs anymore. In China, we saw a loss of 16 million jobs, and it's not like they're going to another developing nation either. They're disappearing up in smoke. They're going nowhere. He's not talking about manufacturing jobs. But more importantly, we have to understand why jobs overall in agriculture have been displaced. Debbie Barker finds that in China, the government estimates that 210 million farmers will be displaced as a result of liberal trade policies, especially through the WTO. Now let's move on to the pro case. On the contention 1, they talk about comparative advantage. We have a few responses. First of all, remember in our contention 1 and contention 2, we tell you why comparative advantage is bad. You insulate the government against the wishes of the people themselves, and instead they're actually responding to the multinational corporations, to the countries. That's problematic because, again, if you want public programs to be financed, you need people who actually need to listen to the people. But secondly, Ha-Jun Chang in his book Bad Samaritans finds that tariff revenues...
That's not the right argument. The right argument isn't, well, if they listen to other corporations, to like other nations and multinational corporations, they won't be listening to the people, and you need that in order for them to help the people. That's fine. The argument you need is do you have any examples like of that actually happening? Like, you don't have any evidence that says any of the money that goes to these governments or increases in GDP creates, like, does India have a welfare program? I don't know. I'd be surprised if they did, right? Like, these are the, like, does India have a welfare program would be a awesome cross-examination question. But, again, like, I can see how these rounds are really appealing to people, because there's like somebody requested a round the other day, and it was a theory round, and they said, well, what happens is the negative reads a theory shell, and then the affirmative reads a counter-interp, and then the negative reads a counter-interp to the counter-interp, which, if you're just like learning about theory, you're like, wow, this is like the Super Saiyan 3 of... Is that a dated comparison? Does that analogy not work? You're like, oh my god, that's like another level that I hadn't even considered. They're so good. What's next? Another counter-interp to that counter-interp? But the answer is that, like, you shouldn't be reading... What? You read the first interp. Like, the only reason to read a counter-interp to the counter-interp is if your first interp wasn't good. If it was good, then the counter-interp shouldn't work well. And that's kind of what's happening here, right? Like, people aren't... The reason why some of these rounds can... And I'm not trying to diminish that this is a good round. And if you enjoy this round, awesome. But what I mean is that there's this impression that can be made that, wow, they're just upping the stakes and just like keep... And it's because they're not really refuting each other's arguments very well. They just have a lot of like stuff prepared. And as soon as they hear something that seems like it relates to an argument they had prepared, they're just like, yeah, you said that, but I say this. And they're not really like picking each other's arguments apart very well. I'm not seeing great D-links, non-uniques, just fundamental counter-arguments. These aren't counter-arguments, they're just more evidence that says something different and doesn't really refute that, other than with the presumption that your author wouldn't say it if it wasn't true. But their author did say it, even though it's not true. Let's keep going.
Key. When we liberalize, we decrease tariffs and we decrease protectionist barriers. The problem is, he finds as a result of globalization, countries have had to decrease their tariff revenues and they've had to cut public programs as a consequence. And he finds that we've only been able to make up to 30% of the tariff revenues. Essentially, we're telling you 70% of their funding is gone. But third, when they talk about Chinese growth being an example of why comparative advantage is good, John Ross finds, with discounting China, we only see that worldwide poverty is actually increased. China's 100% responsible for poverty reduction, but when we're talking about worldwide consequences, Ross finds that 50 million more people have entered poverty from 1981 to 2008. But more importantly, Pranab Martin finds in China specifically, we can also see it was prior to globalization. 2/3 of what poverty reduction happened in China was prior to when China globalized. So again, we're telling you there's no strength of link there. But on foreign direct investment...
But that evidence is like... In 3 seconds, you're trying to tell me, one... Okay, so they did decrease globalization, or the poverty, but actually they made poverty in other places because they weren't globalized and they pulled the work labor out of there, but also this was before they globalized because John something said so. And it's like, dude, take a second and explain the point. Right? Like, I get it. Both of those arguments say that globalization does not decrease poverty. But there's a fundamental narrative that is coming from the affirmative, and you need to explain what the flaw in the narrative is. Because the narrative is going to have 20 examples. So if you take care of the China example, it'll be the India example or the whatever. And eventually the debate will end. And you can't just come up and keep having cards that you had ready about that country or the other country or whatever. You need to tackle the premises behind the arguments. And another thing that the negative needs to be doing that it's not is emphasizing the significance of short-term poverty, making arguments like poverty is cyclical and intergenerational. If you enter poverty, the chances of you ever getting out are really, really low. We talk about this stuff in Parley all the time, and I don't know the exact statistics or the source off the top of my head, but I think it's that if you spend 1 year in poverty, if you weren't in poverty, you spend 1 year in poverty, your chances of ever getting out of poverty are like 60%, 70%. And if you spend more than a year in poverty, there is like only a 20% chance you will ever not be in poverty for the rest of your life. It's stuff like that, right? Because they're talking about long-term justifies the short-term effects on the whatever. And what you want to try to talk about is that, no, like, those short-term effects prevent your long-term goals from being reached. I'm not getting that here. I don't think this seems like a really great speech because there's a lot of evidence. It seems like it's talking about what the affirmative is talking about, but there's dropped responses about why your entire case is talking about the wrong kind of globalization. There's really no focus on the kind of impact framing that you're going to need to win on later in the round because there's no chance you're going to win long-term stuff. I mean, there's not no chance, but the short term has been given to you on a platter, and you're not capitalizing on that, and so on, right? It's detached from the overall strategy that the negative has to go for. These responses aren't tied to the affirmative case in any significant way. And that's something you see a lot in public forum, where the second speaker's responses have nothing to do with what the first speaker's case is trying to argue. And it's not useful because obviously they made it to the final round of a very big tournament, right? But in my opinion, it's not optimal because it hurts your ability to paint a clear message and make a clear case.
There are a couple of problems. First and foremost, you can look again to Chang. He finds prior to globalization in Latin America and in Africa, we saw that income per capita was increasing at 3%. After globalization in the 80s and 90s, it was increasing at 1.7%. It's a comparative decline. But secondly, again, we're telling you that they're cutting local programs, so it doesn't matter if you're stabilizing the economy. It's an economy that's based somewhere else in the world, one that's not benefiting the people. But then, you go to the
based
bottom
on
and they
what?
talk about how
You're not reading the part that says it's not helping the people. You're just reading the part that says it's global.
we actually see $1 in domestic spending as a result of $1 in foreign direct investment. However, you also have to analyze the consequences of what happens with that. Tom Engler, in his book, How to Rule the World, finds that when we have foreign aid and when we fund these kinds of programs, we see what's called debt repayment. Essentially, for every $1 we spend in foreign aid to help these countries have to pay $1.30 back in repayment. That's problematic because, again, they're cutting programs and they're unable to finance what they otherwise should be. Hey, ready? Can I get water? Sure.
Yeah, see, that's why the kid on the left is like bursting out of his seat, ready to go, because so much is conceded.
What does foreign aid have to do with foreign direct investment and opening up trade and financial barriers? At all.
If I could answer.
Yeah, answer.
So foreign direct investment isn't just what we would say private investment, but rather we say that countries have a stake in investing as well.
Do tariffs affect foreign aid and foreign aid donations?
That wasn't the argument made under trade.
No, that's just what I'm asking you. Are they affected by tariff and financial investment liberalization?
I don't think so.
You don't think so. So when economic globalization entails getting rid of barriers to trade and financial investment, that means aid regardless of economic...
Foreign aid is financial investment. Sorry, I thought you said does foreign aid have anything to do with trade liberalization?
Sure, but it's not taxed, is it?
I don't know.
It's not, right? It's aid. Categorically, it is not taxed.
Okay.
Sure. So that means that changing the financial incentive structure does nothing to change the amount of aid that's going to...
Why does that mean that it's not foreign investment?
I'm saying that that's foreign investment that occurs regardless of economic globalization because it's not affected by the disincentives to invest in countries.
Why do countries have an incentive to invest in other countries if they don't expect economic returns?
Matt, you're misunderstanding. What I'm saying is if the U.S. decides to give money to Egypt in the form of military aid, it doesn't matter if Egypt has it disallows FDI and foreign direct investment and things like investing in their country.
No. We're not even talking about military aid, Sinan. English specifically
you're
talks
talking about foreign aid.
Yeah, foreign aid. That
Foreign direct investment is a specific investment in a business in a developing country, or a developed country for that matter, right? So that has nothing to do with aid that you're talking about.
Doesn't foreign direct investment go to the government?
No, it doesn't go to the government. The revenues off of foreign direct investment do go to the government. But we said foreign direct investment, it has to do with mergers and acquisitions with regards to other companies in those countries. Can I ask you a question?
No, you've been asking me questions for like 2 minutes now. Can I ask a question?
You're not giving me answers, but let's go ahead.
Okay, so you attack our second contention by telling us that we've always been dependent on these kinds of fossil fuels, right?
Sure.
So when we're talking about globalization, it's one thing to say that we make it possible to distribute goods and services, but we also have to be able to distribute them, right?
Sure, but what
Can
I'm
we
saying
distribute
is,
goods and services without like fossil fuels or like diesel fuel to like give
that's
cargo ships?
That's not at all what I talked about with regards to my answers. I said, you talked about the cost of goods going up, which meant that scarcity was higher, and therefore there was more conflict. I said that because distribution gets better,
those are
and
two
that
different
produces,
things. See, no,
it's
those are two
not
different
different things.
things.
Absolutely not.
No,
You're talking
we
about
explicitly-
conflict, correct?
But the first thing about commodity prices is separate from the conflict impact.
Why does conflict go up?
Conflict goes up because no party in a country wants to give up control of a profitable resource.
And that's not a commodity?
The party in the country that controls the profitable resource is a multinational corporation. How does that fit into that? What? Like, who controls these resources, Matt? You're saying first it's the governments of these countries, and then it's the multinationals, and somehow somebody doesn't want to give up control of it.
No, we're saying it's the government.
It's the government.
Yeah. Like in Nigeria, for example, we see one of two things. First of all, Goodluck Jonathan hasn't actually spent back.
The negative has been completely unresponsive to the idea of economic globalization, which is what boy on left is about to sit down and like furiously whisper to his partner as she's nodding, and she's like, yeah, no, I got it, I know. And he's gonna be like, but we're talking about, they're just talking about governments, and we're talking about economic globalization. They drop all of the arguments that say that their stuff is not about economic globalization. And even in this cross-examination, when he raised kind of those points, I think the debater on the right is focused on rehashing the carded evidence that he read, right? And isn't engaging with like the reason why his opponent says that doesn't apply. And he's like, well, let me just reiterate the card, but he still has not processed that the affirmative is arguing that economic globalization is not the same thing as globalization. Now, the affirmative is going to try to come up and say the topic actually is about economic globalization, and if they can do that, they can de-link all of the negatives' responses and all of the negatives' like main arguments. That's the strategy. And it would have been a lot harder for them to do that if the negative had right now in the like important face-to-face conversation that they had been able to notice that and start to derail that narrative. But now it's going to come up in the summary, and it's going to have to be like argued about in a really messy grand crossfire, at which point it's mostly too late. But let's see.
As people, but additionally we see civil conflict because no one sees oil revenues going to bed.
All right, don't talk on your way back to your seat. Time's out.
Got somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 minutes.
Okay, we will.
Remember that you're talking to judges. You're not talking to your opponent. That will make you a much, much better debater. Don't talk to your opponent, even in cross-ex, right? Like, because when you talk to somebody, you look for things like them recognizing what you're saying, them understanding certain premises. You try to build, hey, so you know this? And they go, yeah. And they're like, okay, well then this. And then they'll be like, oh, I get it. And when you're having a conversation with someone, you're always looking for those things. When the person you're talking to is your opponent, they're never going to be like, oh, you're right. No, I do get that. They're just going to constantly not get or deny or ignore what you're saying, and you're going to get frustrated And that's not going to help you, but you're also going to repeat things a lot more than the judges actually need. The judge received that information. You don't need to keep saying it. Or maybe you need to be saying something that your opponent isn't like waiting to hear, but your judge probably needs to hear. So it really helps to direct everything you're saying to judges, even during cross-examination. Or at least think about the judges.
Two important observations. No country has actually been able to escape long-term poverty without first industrializing and remaining as an agrarian economy. So because my opponents don't link into industrialization in any way, they automatically lose the link to long-term poverty reduction right there. But even if you do want to see what they say, let's look at their case. In the first contention, they talk about the drug trade, but remember, Matt comes up here and he gives you these responses, but that literally only applies to 5 countries that may not have this comparative advantage and resort to the drug trade. On top of that, this is hardly quantifiable, especially since the illicit drug trade and illegal smuggling was occurring even before this. We don't really know to what extent that has been exacerbated. This is really hard to weigh. Don't look to this contention in the round. On their second contention about oil dependency, again, this is really hard to quantify because earlier we showed you there was still competition over resources. This is essentially non-unique. Now ultimately, also you have commodity prices going down because you don't have every economy being self-sustainable or only caring about themselves. That's going to be really critical. And lastly, they're being very vague about who is controlling these resources. First, they talk about the MNCs, then they talk.
This is something that happens a lot in debate that's annoying when people will be like, yeah, they don't give a lot of examples and they're vague and it's hard to quantify their arguments, but your arguments aren't comparatively, like, given a longer list of examples, or it's not comparatively better quantified. Like, make comparisons. It's not about your opponent being bad. It's about your opponent's case being worse than your case. And making those comparative analyses allows you to talk about your case and frame it around what the judge is going to vote on while you're making refutations. So instead of it being like, this argument's bad, being like, this argument's not as good as this argument.
About the government, but ultimately they're not being very clear. This is, again, a really hard argument to weigh. On the last contention, they talk about this idea about agriculture and how we're going to be harming them. But remember the two critical things Sinan says. First, agricultural efficiency is going to be increasing with technology. That is going to be helping access to food in the long term. On top of that, he explains to you that ultimately bubbles are not inherently bad because they represent a good sign of investment. Those two things get extended. And lastly, and most importantly, this is the clear link to industrialization that my opponents are missing. We're showing you here that you're shifting from an agrarian economy to an industrialized economy.
See, that's a really good example of an argument that if you actually, like, sat down to look at it, you'd be like, what are you saying? You're saying food prices increasing isn't bad because people will see that food is a good investment? What, otherwise people wouldn't be aware that without food you die? Like, what is the scenario you're talking about here? Like, oh, the cost of bread went up, and people are going to be like, oh man, bread's like really like a money maker. Do people die if they don't have bread? I should start a bakery. Like, what is the scenario you're describing? So much generic evidence and generic analysis trying to be applied to a really specific scenario, which is public forum.
When you have globalization, that's going to be critical. That links into our framework. But now let's look at our offense. First, on comparative advantage, they basically talk about how you're going to be cutting public programs, and that's what decreased tax revenues are doing. But remember that you can't actually solve poverty just through government programs. You need to have industrialization. That's what comparative advantage allows, because it allows for specialization that opens the market up to new niches. At this point, you can clearly extend our first contention. Lastly, on foreign direct investment, he only talks about this correlative evidence from Latin America and Africa where, like, GDP growth went down. Ultimately, this is correlative. Remember Klein at the bottom of our case, who shows you in an 80 study meta-analysis that FDI actually has economic growth benefits, and you can extend all time for awards.
Okay, a couple things. One, you didn't talk about the economic globalization versus whatever, which your partner sure would have appreciated. But second, like, you're saying that, oh, like, this example where they're talking about Latin America and Africa, like the two biggest, poorest places, is just correlative. It wasn't globalization that brought the poverty down. It's just globalization happened to be happening and poverty happened to be increasing. But doesn't that at the very least disrupt your narrative that globalization increased wages? Like, you know, like they say, you know, shark attacks and ice cream sales are correlated, or like drownings and ice cream sales are correlated. And it's like, well, yeah, actually, because they both have an alternative cause, is heat. The hotter it is, the more often you're going to the pool, and the hotter it is, the more often you're buying ice cream. So ice cream sales don't cause drownings. Sure. But you certainly then couldn't win an argument that says ice cream sales decrease drownings, because at the very least there is correlation showing that they don't have a causal relationship between them. That while one increases, the other one can just do whatever it wants. So, more thoughts that are not relevant because no one's going to mention anything resembling it. Who is this man?
Everybody ready? Okay. First off, don't just let our opponents extend all 5 of their impacts without explaining their work why, so therefore they brought that argument to today's ground. But then first off, on their argument about...
Like, this is like a classic, like, they did something wrong, so they lose. Like, they extended impacts without explaining why, so give me a plausible reason why they don't happen. Like, when you say nothing back, it's hard to hold it against them for not having said more about it, right? Like, give me something. Give me an analysis that I can write down.
Okay, so they try to link into economic growth through this. However, remember that these are actually harming these developing countries. Remember what Matthew brought up in his rebuttal. Chang tells us that after forced trade liberation occurred in these countries, they lost out on the revenue of their tariffs. As a result, these developing countries lost 70% of their funding directly because of trade liberalization. And as a result, this results in a direct cut in educational and healthcare funding. So ultimately, we're entrenching these countries in long-term poverty because they can no longer fund these programs that are necessary for economic growth. But then we remember the evidence from Ross that tells us that without accounting for China, poverty worldwide has actually increased. So you can't necessarily say that there hasn't been any success with globalization. But then furthermore, this success in China, 2/3 of it happened before globalization even started. So there's this correlative and not even caused by globalization. The first major voter in today's debate is going to be betting the farm. Remember that we're talking about how these poor farmers are being pushed out because of the tech and mechanization from these multilateral corporations that are taking the jobs of the poor farmers. As a result, 210 million farmers have been pushed out of their jobs in China alone. And they try to tell you that these people will just go into urban jobs. However, they never specifically tell you that this is happening. In fact, in China, we see that since globalization has started, we've lost 16 million of these manufacturing jobs.
Okay, so one thought on what she's saying now, and then one thought more generally. The thought on what she's saying now is that a really great term for everybody to keep in mind in debates, especially on topics like this, is the links have been tested. And what that means is, look, the scenario we're talking about in the debate has happened. Maybe in one specific example, maybe globally across many different countries. Which means that if you're claiming a certain outcome would, can happen, you should be able to point to an instance where it already has. And that is something that the negative has going for them. The links have been tested. We did this. Here's the loss of jobs. Here is the poverty. Here is the inability for countries to pay back the whatever and the loans and the so on. Whereas the affirmative is not really pointing to, okay, here is a country that, like, where globalization has literally directly helped. So the links have been tested is how you want to frame that. But what I think is, you guys been staring at the cursor being on the screen, at like begging me to move it, because I do that all the time when I'm watching stuff like this. But the other issue is that she's trying to go for voters that, like, we haven't really been hearing about. Her partner didn't really extend or put much focus on a lot of this stuff, and the opponents certainly haven't had to put a lot of focus on it, so it's just not really that much in the forefront of my mind. You know what is in the forefront of my mind? The idea that no country has gotten out of poverty without industrializing. And that hasn't left my mind because it's been brought up in, like, every opportunity that the affirmative has had to bring it up, which is why constructing a narrative and knowing what scenarios you win in, what you need to prove in order to win in those scenarios, is really important, because you can kind of adjust as the debate goes, but basically plant the seeds for all of that as you're going along. And you're not going to kind of like come up in a later speech and be like, remember this thing we mentioned 20, 30, 35 minutes ago? But let's keep going.
So there aren't any of these urban jobs for them to go into. But furthermore, these poor aren't even the ones that are accessing the increased supply of food on the market, simply because these.
But also, if you're the negative and you're going for the links that have been tested, I would love to see much more specific analysis. Here is the amount of globalization that happened in this place. Here is what happened to their poverty. Like, one of the two sides should be making that analysis, right? The evidence, one, must exist, and two, it must benefit one side more than another side. So why is neither side saying it? Why is no one directly saying, hey, here is some metric of how much somewhere was globalized, and here is what happened to their poverty. Here's what happened to their poverty in the short term. Here's what happened to it in the long term. Here's where it's trending now. It must benefit one side. And it seems like very compelling evidence, given that it's entirely framed around measuring the evidence behind this idea, right? It's not a policy proposal for something that hasn't happened anywhere yet. It's just like, hey, this thing happened. Did it do good? Why don't we measure it?
Corporations go in and buy the land for export commodities in the developed world. So the poor aren't even accessing the benefits of these food supplies. Then second, we look towards resource conflicts increasing. We give you the direct warrant. Because of increased scarcity, because of globalization, this increases intra-state conflicts among the factions within the state. Our only attack is that we don't necessarily quantify this, but this still stands at the end of the debate. For these reasons, we debate.
You guys ready?
Yeah.
So, let's say a country industrializes.
Sure.
It shifts from a primarily agrarian to a primarily industrial structure, right?
Yeah.
And then subsequently, it shifts from an industrial to a service sector-based structure, correct? Okay. So there would be a loss of manufacturing jobs, right? Because as we said, comparative advantage is dynamic. China doesn't have the labor advantage in low-skill manufacturing perpetually, but they shift their economy to higher rung of the economic class.
What's the question?
Is the Warsaw evidence also says, yes, manufacturing jobs in China are disappearing, but they're also not going anywhere else. So it's not like we're moving these manufacturing.
That doesn't answer the question, though. Like, that doesn't. Those manufacturing jobs are not moving anywhere else. You are correct. But that does not mean that. Is your evidence saying these people are. Because the affirmative is trying to say these people are now moving into service industry jobs. Does your evidence say that they're not moving into service industry jobs? That these people are becoming unemployed? Because that would negate what they're saying. If your argument is that, like, you know, like, employment at the Blockbuster video is decreasing, and I gotta tell you, Blockbuster isn't moving anywhere else, that doesn't tell me anything about what's happening with the people that used to work at Blockbuster.
Jobs to another development. Can I finish my answer, please? It's not like we're moving these manufacturing jobs anywhere else to these other developing countries that require manufacturing, that require industrialization. We're saying they're disappearing altogether.
So manufacturing just decreased by a huge amount. Global output of manufacturing plummeted. Is that what you're telling me?
Yes.
Probably.
Okay. So isn't it more likely that that's as a result of, I don't know, a recession rather than something like globalization, and it's in spite of globalization?
What?
Like, how do you attribute the loss in manufacturing jobs, possibly, right, like a net loss of manufacturing jobs, to globalization at all? Like, logically. Just because it happens empirically, right? We're saying it might happen in spite of that.
Well, okay. We're saying...
What's the link is what you want to ask.
Okay, we're using the logic in the Forbes evidence that you use in order to say that we're shifting from agriculture to industrial.
What is the logic?
Specifically, what Worstall says is even when you have demand for cheap labor in manufacturing, you still displace it by automation in industry. So
ultimately, there's a difference between low-skilled and high-skilled manufacturing, right?
Yeah.
So the type of manufacturing that happens in America is the one that's primarily reliant on these types of technology and like automation and things. That's the high-skill manufacturing that happens here. The low-skill manufacturing happening in China is not entirely, it's not being automated and it's not reliant on these type of machinery. There's a difference between the two, right?
Okay, making an argument and then saying right is not a question. I feel like I say that every single time I do one of these round analysis videos. It's a pet peeve, but it's also a waste of cross-examination. Which, I don't know why we even need cross-examination this late into the debate, because you can't make new arguments. So what are you using these questions for, other than to just bicker? Additionally, none of these arguments matter. None of these points matter. None of the questions being asked right now are pertaining to what, in my mind, is the big voter issues.
So you're specifically saying that the farmers who lost their jobs in China then went into this high school.
No, we're saying that yes, it's problematic if they lost their jobs, but unfortunately you can't attribute that to globalization, because if there's such a sudden decrease in manufacturing.
Even if it's due to globalization, right, that would be, you have to look at that on net, right? None of these jobs, of the 260 million jobs that were created, would have been created at all absent globalization. So that means that on net, there's still a creation of jobs, right?
Well, we would argue that it doesn't matter if you're continually displacing people. If you create instability,
You're also continually creating jobs.
There's no
Now we're
people
going
escape
for
poverty if they're
instability?
continually cycling between employment and unemployment.
I don't think.
What?
Like, I don't even see where the wage increases are occurring. So
Okay,
at the point
if
where
I'm
they're only
unemployed and I
cycling
get a job, that's a wage increase, right? Now I have a
Wait,
wage.
if you move from job to job, are we saying that
I don't,
inherently
they're not
there's a
doing
wage
it, they're being
increase?
employed when they were unemployed before.
Okay,
No, but
how
we're
does
saying
this-
when you... Okay, Sina, you can't say you're solving a problem that you create and you create benefits.
If
No,
we're
there's
creating
some-
260 million jobs, 16 million people might need to go to another job, but that's also being created by a new industry that now
Worldwide,
creates
you're
another
creating-
200 million jobs. On net, you're still going to be creating more jobs for people who
Worldwide,
are
you're creating
previously unemployed.
260 million. In China alone, we're saying you're damaging 210 million.
Okay, but are they... do you have evidence that says they hurt more than 50 million somewhere else? Because that sounds like... I'm no doctor.
Audience ready?
It sounds
Yeah.
like a 50 million net.
Ultimately, they're trying to cover up what they lack in argumentation with the evidence that they're trying to give you. We told you that absent a fundamental shift from a primarily agrarian economy to a primarily industrial economy,
See, you knew that would come
cannot
up.
eliminate poverty in
Yeah.
a sustainable way. We need to set these countries on the proper trajectory for sustainable growth. You can't spend your way out with government programs. That's not effective. You need to create jobs. That's what they don't look to. Domestically, that capital doesn't exist in developing countries. So we told you that globalization is the sole means by way which you can get that capital from foreign direct investment, because it is a high-cost industry. And we told you that
See, what he's doing right now is just reiterating the narrative. What is the story we are telling? What are the steps along the way that explain it? The negative is going to have a really hard time telling a clear story, because their story is what? Like, there are places where jobs exist because of globalization, but globalization is costing other jobs somewhere else. Keep that math in mind. And then these jobs get lost because of globalization. And there's also drugs. And what the drugs do is that they hurt people's jobs. Like, it's going to be way more scattered, because that's been the focus from coming from the negative.
growth. The 80 study meta-analysis on economic growth is the best study in today's round and tells you that unequivocally foreign direct investment increases economic growth, and the bottom 40% of that goes to the poor people in those countries. So we tell you that jobs are needed. Because when you build factories in those countries for manufacturing, somebody needs to be employed now. And we tell you with the ILO evidence that 260 million people are now employed, whereas before they weren't, because they need to create a supply to meet the demand that is now accessible to them when trade barriers are reduced. They never address that. But then, all of the arguments they're giving you about drugs, about fuel costs and farmers, none of it's quantified. We don't know to what extent that it's happening. They just literally tell you there might be more conflict. There might be some of this. They don't show you it's materialized. They just say, well, we think that these arguments are going to work. We told you, A, the cost of goods is going to go down when not now every country needs to be self-sufficient. In a protectionist world, every country needs to create every single thing. We think that comparative advantage mitigates every single one of the harms that they talk about. They say, well, if we take out China, then it's really, really good. You don't get to take out the best example of this with the most people being affected and then say, well, then we think it's pretty good. We think that's unfair, and we think that takes out of scope the number of people being affected globally and then just trying to help them with their evidence. So, ultimately, you need to look at the fact that we shift from an agrarian to an industrial economy. It doesn't stay static, and comparative advantage is dynamic. That's why not all of this happens at the same time. That's why it's long-term, and ultimately, that's why we're very proud to affirm. Thank you.
Great speech. I don't know. A lot of energy there, a lot of emotion. Probably fair, but great speech. I mean, it's what I've been saying, right?
Are my judges ready? My opponents? Okay.
Carol
So
is ready.
Might be reduced by increasing jobs, by increasing the amount of money that's going to the poor. But you still have to look towards the numbers at the end of the day of how many people are actually being lifted out of poverty. Here we're the ones who are winning the argument. When you're voting on the economic scale of poverty, remember, we're telling you, discounting China, 50 million more people were pushed into poverty than before. But remember, Sinan's only response to this, which comes in the final focus, not even in the summary that's been cleanly extended by us, is that we don't have to just look towards other countries. But remember, we're looking at worldwide poverty reduction. But additionally, we tell you that Chinese poverty reduction wasn't even a result of globalization. We do terminal defense on their Chinese argument, and elsewhere we do offense.
But the 50 million decrease was because of globalization?
So there's no reason why you should be signing your ballot for the affirmative. But additionally on economics, remember, Sinan's making the argument for us. He tells you that comparative advantage is dynamic, but that logically doesn't make sense because we're telling you that comparative advantage isn't dynamic. Manufacturing jobs are disappearing up in smoke, not going to other developing countries. If comparative advantage were dynamic, we would see that these jobs would be moving out of China as it develops to another developing country, but they're not. So at the end of the day, in terms of developing, Sinan may tell you that we have to shift from an agrarian
This is all
to an
very
industrial society,
defensive.
but he doesn't tell you.
I've said this a lot, so you might know it. Maybe this is the first Proteus video you've ever watched. Hi, I'm Sasan, and I yell at children a lot. I'm sorry, I don't like it. I prefer judging around from 6 years ago than... I think earlier this year was the first time that I did one of these for, like, a current year competitor. I felt really weird about it, because I was like, these kids are, like, competing now, and they're, like, watching me say things about something they did a month ago. I feel less weird about this. Look, every game, by nature of being a game, has what's called a win condition. That's what makes it a game. And every game, because it has a win condition, has offense, which is something that a player does to further themselves toward the win condition, and most of them have defense, which is something they do to prevent an opponent from reaching the win condition. Both are good, both are important, but you can win with just offense alone. As long as your offense, even despite the opponent's defense, is able to, like, outpace the opponent's offense. But it's really hard to win on just defense, which means at the end of the day, what is offense? What is defense? Here's impacts, right? Here's like what you're saying happens. In debate, offense is saying something happens, and defense is saying something does not happen. And most of this speech has been defensive because it's saying something does not happen. The only offense that we've heard is when you discount China, 50 million people have been put more into poverty than they were before, which why discount China? So what I'd like to hear is, okay, what is the negative's offense? What are you saying? What is the instance of not globalization that improved poverty? Not that that's something the negative has to prove, but that's because that's how they've allowed themselves to be framed. They haven't come up and been like, look, we don't have to prove that not globalizing improves poverty rates better than globalizing. We just have to prove that this thing isn't effective. That's not how they frame things. And now I don't have anything to compare. I'm looking for offense from the negative, and I guess I have 20 seconds to hear it.
Where globalization fits into the picture of this.
Offense could have been drug trade, right? That would have been offense because globalization creates a drug trade which uniquely causes poverty. But that wasn't what the second negative speaker went for, so that's not what the first negative speaker then went for in summary, and here we are. So it's just been, right, ideally your first speech is all offense, and you're carrying some of that offense through, and you're making strategic decisions for which piece of offense you're going to focus on later on in the debate. But yeah, let's go back so I can hear that again.
So, at the end of the day, in terms of developing, Sinan may tell you that we have to shift from an agrarian to an industrial society, but he doesn't tell you where globalization fits into the picture of this argument in terms of development. He doesn't tell you why this actually leads to development. More specifically, again on the economic side, when we tell you that trade liberalization, in response to their first contention, actually cuts public programs. Remember, prior to globalization, these countries relied on tariff revenues. We've cut more than 70% of the revenues for these public programs, and as a result, we don't even have long-term domestic sustainability. It's one thing to say that foreign companies can enter a country and actually create economic growth, and it's another to say that these domestic countries can then sustain it even when foreign countries lose interest. But the problem is they will and they won't actually be able to sustain it. Then on social poverty, we tell you as a result of comparative...
So real quick, let's talk about that rule. So when that argument is framed as defensively as it is, the negative is basically making it the affirmative's debate to lose, and I'm the judge, and I'm thinking, okay, are you able to take out the whole argument, or is there some way that I plausibly buy this argument? So the negative is saying, hey, just because you've said that you're going from agrarian to industrialized doesn't mean that that is because of globalization. One, that is incredibly new, and something that you had about 8 opportunities to mention before, and haven't. Second, I think they have outlined how that is a product of globalization. Next, they're saying that pre-globalization, countries had tariffs, which accounted for a lot of their revenue, and now they lose those tariffs because we've globalized and focused on more free trade. But I'd have to believe that there's a country that on tariffs and not globalizing in any sort of definition that I've been given so far, what are they trading and how are they trading so much of it that they've gone from agrarian to industrialized, which is the premise that you're trying to respond to. All I have to do is think of a country that's gone from agrarian, or let's say pre-industrialized to industrialized, or a city or something like that. I mean, Dubai, industrialized and modernized incredibly quickly. Does the story that I hear from the affirmative or negative most closely resemble did Dubai industrialize despite globalization? No, it probably industrialized because of globalization and foreign investment, both publicly in their oil from other countries and privately in individual companies. So, I don't know, it just seems like you're trying to make this argument seem like it's full of holes because you're the second speaker and that's what you do, but you don't have anything that you're weighing against it, or that you're really arguing for your side, which makes your case really defensive, which means if I buy anything, then I'm probably giving it to the affirmative, which is probably the 1,000-yard stare that you're seeing from Carol over there, thinking about the offense that they had that just completely got thrown by the wayside.
They will and they won't actually be able to sustain it. Then on social poverty, we tell you as a result of comparative advantage, you actually entrench corruption, you entrench these
We're
regimes.
still on comparative advantage, which is the affirmative argument. We're not talking about any contention. This is the final focus. I'm not being finally focused on anything having to do with the negatives advocacy.
Not only in drug trafficking, but also in resource conflicts. Ultimately, when you're talking about this, when you look at the numbers, we're telling you 210 million farmers in China were being displaced. You can't solve a problem that the affirmative is creating in the first place.
Okay, yeah, let's see. If I had to vote, I'm voting for the affirmative. Basically for the reasons I was told to in the final focus. Let's see what happened. Princeton is the pros, a 4-1 decision. Yeah, it's pretty clear. And I bet this one was a pretty squirrely, I connected a bunch of dots myself type decision. But, I mean, I don't know. I wasn't there. So, oh, what do we do? How are we doing on time? 1 hour 27. Oh, no. Look how bad the lag is. Has the lag been this bad the whole time? Is that any better? Ah, that's sad. Well, we'll see how the finished product is. Is this? Oh. Oh, maybe the lag was only in the transition? Let's hope. Hey, you've been great. I've been Sasan. I'll catch you on the next one. Hopefully soon. But yeah, put other rounds and stuff in the thing, and I'll add it to the other thing, and you'll enjoy that, I hope.